Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we wish to start a 3-week series with you, and in doing so I want to first of all thank Lewis-Clark State College in Lewiston, Idaho. And they have joined with North Idaho College in co-sponsoring a symposium, and they have been so generous as to share their guest with us. And today we will have, as I've indicated, the first of a 3-week series. It's my pleasure to welcome to the program Mr. David C. Rudder. He has come to us from Australia. He is at the present time Australia's Consul General in San Francisco, California, and has been in that position since October 1986. He has the responsibility in that office of serving his country in the areas of Northern California, Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Northern Nevada, Oregon, Washington, and Wyoming. Our guest is a career office service specialist for his country and has been serving his country in foreign service since 1962. And Mr. Rudder has served in such countries as Singapore, France, India, Indonesia, and the United Kingdom as some examples. He was born in Australia, in South Australia, and he and his wife Wendy have 2 daughters. Mr. Rudder, it's a pleasure to start this series out with you, and we welcome you to our city and the state of Idaho.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here, and you know, we could only congratulate and commend the college for focusing some attention on Australia in this year, because it's our bicentenary year and a pretty important year to us. So it was, I think, a great initiative on the part of the college to invite us up here.
Well, it is our privilege to have you here, and we look forward to asking you questions in your many areas of expertise. And I want to welcome to the panel Janelle Burke, who is an attorney and has been on this program for 14 years, and I will invite Janelle to commence the questioning.
Mr. Rudder, can you tell us what kind of education and background you have, what kind of experiences you've had that have led to your present position? Something about the kind of experiences that would lead you into being a Consul General.
Well, I joined the career service in 1962. It's a competitive, not so much examination, but selection procedure. My educational background is nothing spectacular in that, I can assure you, but the qualities required in the Australian Foreign Service, resilience and adaptability, some ability, language abilities. Mine have been mainly in the Asian languages because I've served in Indonesia and Singapore, so I have some Bahasa, Indonesian and Malay. I think probably one of the highlights in my career was to be appointed High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, which High Commissioner has the same, Sri Lanka is a Commonwealth country, it's the same rank as Ambassador. That was probably the highlight of my career so far, before I was posted to the United States, because as you know, Sri Lanka's been going through a difficult time, and we're a good friend of Sri Lanka, so it was a responsible position to represent your country in what were very difficult circumstances for that country.
Now, in San Francisco, in your present post, do you have particular duties? Are you in the general area of dealing in a relationship with the United States, or do you have a specific area that you deal with in particular, such as economics, for example?
Well, the Consul General, and I think for most countries, Consuls General have the same set of responsibilities. You're really there to promote the interests of your country. Now, that might be to assist the promotion of trading interests. I have staff in the Consulate General, trade commissioners. That's their job, to get out and to meet American importers that might be interested in Australian goods. We have an important information role to play. We like to get the message across on some of the Australian policies. At the present time, we've been focusing a little on on trade policies, things about American policies that worry Australia. That does absorb some time. That means calling on people, business people, people in government, congressmen, academics and so on, to try and get our messages through. We also foster cultural relationships. We have visiting artistic groups, orchestras and so on, and this year with the bicentenary there's a huge program of American cultural groups going to Australia to perform there. So we're engaged in that sort of thing as well. This depends what's current and what the priority is on a particular day, really, as to what I'm doing. But I spend, as I said, a lot of time on policy questions, and that's a traditional role of a Consul General.
And I take it that you both represent your country's interests here, but you also are a listening or an earpiece for your country to return to give information back to your country on what the role and what's going on in this country.
Exactly. Yes, that again is a traditional responsibility of a Consul General to keep his government informed and to keep my ambassador in Washington informed of trends and thinking, local political developments and patterns that might be emerging that may be of interest to Australia.
I would like to pursue some policy questions with you on the program, and I know that we have a lot of debate within our government between military solutions to what we perceive as certain problems, which is oftentimes counter to diplomacy as a source for resolution of conflict among nation states. Could you give us your overall view as a Consulate General for your government as to what you see the status of the world today in relation to these two rather diametrically opposed approaches? Particularly I'm addressing the Middle East and the problems that are there in Central America. We've had a lot of debate over Nicaragua and so forth. Where do we stand at this moment, in your opinion, on trying to resolve some of those problems? Are we headed more toward a military conflict, or are those involved going to find some diplomatic solution to some of those conflicts?
Well, I don't know. I think that I should first say that Australia doesn't try and unnecessarily, unduly attempt to influence matters outside of its own sphere, and our particular interests are in our own region. We're a small country, 15 million people, 16 million people. There's a limit to what impact our views might have when we're dealing with superpowers or major powers. But we have a very good relationship, political relationship with this government in the United States. Has probably never been better. So when we feel as though we should insert something into the debate on matters which are perhaps somewhat remote from Australian interests and what the issues about which the Australian public, for them, not preoccupation. Well, this is done privately. It's done through the very important and good relationships we have with the leaders of this country. And our Foreign Minister and our Prime Minister they have excellent personal relationships with people like Mr. Schultz. So I don't think Australia could say that we've got the answers to what might happen in Central America or the Middle East. We support, being a country of a middle-sized country, we certainly support regional solutions to problems, and we certainly support multilateralism in endeavouring to deal with these problems.
When you're more directly affected, such as in your part of the world, are your good offices available to governments such as the United States and others that are addressing such problems as in places like the Philippines?
I think there is obviously a very close contact and degree of consultation between the two governments on very many issues. There always has been, and I think there always will be. We share information. We, in general, have the same aspirations. We're similar countries in a way. We have similar. There's some amazing parallels in our history, and therefore some of the problems we see pretty well along similar lines, but not all of them. You know, you've got a natural asymmetry between a superpower and a middle-sized regional power. That's what we are. We have enough preoccupations in our own region, dealing with large countries much larger than us that are near neighbours. We have to conduct relationships with these countries. We have the ASEAN countries. We have good relationships with ASEAN. We have special responsibilities, I think, to assist the economic development of some of the small sovereign Pacific states. So, sure, we take a very close interest in the Middle East. Our ministers, our foreign minister was recently in the Middle East. We like to see for ourselves what's going on. But I don't think we've got all of those solutions up there in neon, and I'm not sure that I've seen them here in neon either. But
thank you, Janelle Burke.
I want to get a little bit more specific about the relationship between Australia and the United States, particularly in the area of trade relations. What kinds of things are going on, and what can we expect in the future?
We have a very healthy trading relationship. The United States is our number 2 trading partner. Japan is number 1 trading partner. It runs at about $10 billion a year, the two-way trade. The United States is in a fortunate position of having a trading balance in its favour of about 2-to-1 ratio.
What kinds of things are traded?
Well, we buy very expensive capital items from the United States, aircraft. We are a very big customer of the Boeing Aircraft Corporation. I think at the present time we're of 3rd importance in terms of orders. We buy scientific equipment, computers.
And what does the United States buy from you? Maybe I stopped you too soon.
No, they are the major items. In addition, of course, we've traditionally, for very many years, been a major purchaser of American military equipment. And I think there's only one other country, in fact, that buys more and pays cash, hard cash, than Australia. I don't know who it is, but I just want to indicate that we are a major buyer of American equipment. What do we sell here? Well, of course, agricultural goods, or commodities. Meat, beef is a major import, lamb is a major import. They're the 2 most important things.
So yours are more in the agricultural line than the things that you sell to the United States?
Most definitely, yeah.
And what kind of, in terms of numbers, do you have some figures as to what kinds of numbers the United States is purchasing from Australia?
Well, it's about, the total trade would be about $4 billion. I would think that beef and lamb probably run into $1.5 billion.
Is more trade carried on with Australia on one side of the country than the other? Is the West Coast more active in its trading relationship than the East Coast?
No, I would think most of the exports to the US come from the East Coast of Australia. The commodities are taken into the eastern ports. Western Australia is a very major exporter to Japan because we have huge mineral iron ore. I mean, a lot of the Toyotas that are being sold in this country, in fact, are made from Australian iron ore.
And what is the Australian government's position as far as certain kinds of regulations on exports and imports?
Our position, as I said, we have a healthy relationship in the trading area, but we've got some problems, and these are well known in Washington, and they relate to the ground rules of conducting agricultural trade, because the United States applies particularly to grain exports an export enhancement program, which is in fact a subsidy program for grains. We've been complaining very strongly about the fact that we have been losing markets because of subsidies. Now, we understand too that the United States introduced the subsidies a few years ago to counter the same sort of practices from the European community. We were able to understand that at the time, but now that it's affecting our markets and our economic welfare, we're complaining bitterly about it. And what we want is to see solutions to this whole problem, because we believe there is a real crisis. We presently do have a crisis in the world agricultural trading arrangements, and we need to reform the ground rules. We need to rewrite the rules, and this can only be done through the GATT. Now, the GATT is in session now. We've been working very hard with the United States too, I might add, and with a group of countries that we call the free traders, 14 countries, including Canada, the United States, the Argentine, to try and grapple with this problem of how do you cope with crazy market conditions when the major and the most efficient agricultural producers are all producing surplus commodities which there's no market there for. So it's a huge problem for the United States. It's a big problem for us because we have just had to reduce our acreage, we've had to reduce the number of people on the land.
And do you find support for your position among American farmers?
I would think generally not, because they, of course, are the recipients of these subsidies in the longer run. Please don't misunderstand me. We have studied very carefully the plight of the American farmer. We know how difficult this is for what we want to happen, and that is those subsidies rolled back and eventually phased out. And the President Reagan in Venice, in the Venice Economic Summit last year, said that the United States would phase these subsidies out within 10 years. But we have noticed recently there have been some grain sales that are not really consistent, under conditions which are not really consistent with that objective. So we have to make our views known in Washington, and we have done so, and we'll continue to do so.
Mr. Rutter, I want to give you the opportunity to serve as what we call in the United States a representative of the Chamber of Commerce, in this case from your country, as we speak to viewers throughout the Pacific Northwest today on this program. Could you give those individuals some insight to why they should visit your country? And tourism is something that's I know it's very important among nation states that are as friendly as the United States and Australia. What can they see, and what is exciting about coming to Australia?
Well, 5 years ago there were only about, and we thought the numbers were big then, 60,000 Americans travelling to Australia each year. This year it could reach 380,000, 400,000. Australia, of the OECD countries, has the most spectacular rate of increase in development of tourism. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is the fact that we have spent a lot of money in this country advertising. Secondly, we were assisted by a very good exchange rate, and still are, for the American is getting, he was getting 1.5 Australian dollars for the US dollar, which is very nice. Airfares across the Pacific are very competitive. There were other things that caused a focus on Australia: the America's Cup, the bicentenary. Certain movies like Crocodile Dundee were very successful in this country, and the National Geographic have done a full issue on Australia. I mean, we've had a marvellous and generous coverage here. Hundreds of thousands of Americans are going out for the events I discussed earlier with the bicentenary celebrations. There's There's about 100 schools sending their school bands to Australia. I mean, the children are going, choirs are going, ballet companies and so on. And I think this is providing a marvellous seeding effect. I can hardly go into any small town in the United States without meeting somebody that's either going or has been. And Australia has some of the world's great physical features, just as I'm finding the great physical features here very exciting to me in these states, marvellous mountains and so on. We don't have so many mountains, but we've got 22,000 miles of beautiful coastline that's uninhabited. I mean, there are beaches that are so long nobody can give them a name. They just call them the 300-mile beach. Pure water, pure sand. There's the Great Barrier Reef, part of the World Heritage. There's the Kakadu National Park. There's the great diversity of rainfall, forest to desert to pasture land to beaches and harbours and oceans, and it's all there. But I should put in a plug for the poor old Australian. When I talk to people and say, "Oh well, you're back. Did you enjoy it?" Yes, the people were marvellous. That was the thing that seems to be the greatest attraction. That they get on so well. There is this natural affinity between Australians and Americans. There's no doubt about that. It goes back into our history, and there's a great admiration for America as a great country in Australia. We don't always agree with everything that you do over here, but the drive and the energy and this sort of great democracy really is of great importance to us, and our relationship has always dominated, been a preoccupation for Australia as a smaller partner.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
I have two questions. The first one is maybe a little bit shorter question. The first one has to do with the arts and in Australia. And for those people who visit, I know you have a spectacular opera house. Would you like to tell us about that a little bit?
Well, it is one of the wonders of the world. You know, the construction of that went on for about 15 years and created all sorts of problems because they broke through into new design and new engineering problems. It's in a marvellous position I mean, Sydney Harbour is one of the great harbours of the world, so there's no doubt about that as scenic beauty. The Opera House, well, what more can I say? Joan Sutherland is an Australian and she sings in the Opera House. That's the sort of quality of performance. The great Australian Ballet Company, the Sydney Dance Company, which is coming to the United States next month and is going straight on from New York to Covent Garden. That's their hometown. Art and culture in Australia has an important place in our lives to the same extent that it does in this country, I think. But the Americans do enjoy the Sydney Opera House. There's no doubt about that. And also in Melbourne, there's a great art and cultural centre there, which is getting a worldwide reputation. In Adelaide, which is the capital of South Australia, the Adelaide Festival of Arts, been running since 1957, I think, it's not as well known as the Edinburgh Festival, but the same quality of people and being employed to direct it, and we're getting the same quality of artists and writers and painters and so on to come out for the Edinburgh Festival. So there's a lot to be seen in Australia on that side.
Now, I was suspecting that I'm going to get the last question possibly before the program ends. I wanted to talk a little bit about, come full circle from where we started at the very beginning, talk about the global economy. You're a person who has been in many areas of the world. Why is it important for us to look at things in terms of the entire world situation rather than looking at it just in terms of the very small one country interest?
Well, you know, one of the themes, one of the discussion panels at the college's conference is the global village. And if we're really going to have a global village, and things seem to be going that way, we do have to consider the interests of others. I mean, you look at the amount of energy and generosity that the United States has put into the development of infrastructure of very many poor countries. Been some great success stories, there have been some disasters too, but it doesn't make sense to have the Western developed world putting in a sizable percentage of their gross national product into the economic development of smaller countries that were often called third world or least developed countries and so on, and then ignore their interests when it comes to trade. We give them, assist these countries to get the means to develop perhaps a little export base, and then we don't give them access to the markets. And that, you know, I go back to my earlier point that this must be resolved in a multilateral way, at a venue, in a forum that small countries can sit alongside big countries and discuss these trading issues. It's just as important to them. If you have just the big players, if you have just the United States and Japan and that part of the Pacific Rim, and forget about the other part of the Pacific Rim, I don't think it's going to work.
What is your view from the negotiations that are going on between countries that are espousing free trade and those who are very protective-oriented? Do you see the movement to continue, that more and more countries will accept the philosophy that we have to have in this global village more and more free trade and less barriers?
Well, I think, Australia is not a country that likes to throw the blame and the onus onto the United States for every issue, but the United States is still the world's greatest economic power, and the United States must therefore take the leadership in these reforms to ensure that free trade does become a real fact again. I mean, after all, it was the United States, after the war, that led the Western countries into the reconstruction of Europe and the reconstruction of Japan. It can now lead the world into reform of trading conditions.
In relation to that, where do you think the greatest work is left to be done to cause that to happen? What parts?
Well, I'm only a guest in this country, and I wouldn't like to comment too much on what happens in your Congress. But I can assure you we've been watching very closely protectionist sentiments coming out of there, and the trade bill. I mean, the debate inside the United States on the trade bill is something we've taken a very close interest in.
With that, I have to bring our program to conclusion. On behalf of Janelle and our staff, we thank you. It's been most informative, and you've been very gracious with your time.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been David Rudder, who is the Australian Consul General in San Francisco. We hope you've enjoyed that program, and be with us again next week when we continue this series with another guest talking about New Zealand and Australia in that program. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.